Welcome students. Today we will start with NCERT Class 12 Economics, that is Part A, Chapter 5, Problems of Deficient Demand and Excess Demand. So let's start. Problems of Deficient Demand. So first is meaning of deficient demand. A situation when the aggregate demand is less than the aggregate supply in an economy corresponding to full employment in the economy is termed as deficient demand. Next, graphical representation of deficient demand. So you see here in this figure, the x-axis measures the level of output and income and y-axis measures the aggregate demand. And here, the deflationary gap is the gap showing demand deficient of current aggregate demand over aggregate supply at the level of full employment. It is called deflationary because it leads to deflation. Now let us suppose that an imaginary economy, by employing all its available resources, can produce 10,000 quintal of rice. If aggregate demand of rice is say 8,000 quintals, this demand will be called a deficient demand and a gap of 2,000 quintals will be called as deflationary gap. So here, the equilibrium between aggregate demand and aggregate supply is at the point less than level of full employment. Next, causes of deficient demand. Deficient demand in an economy may be caused by any of the following factors. So point number 1 is fall in the levels of consumption and investment. Private consumption expenditure is a major component of aggregate demand. Any reduction in it will lead to deficiency in demand. Investment expenditure is another important component of aggregate demand. Point number 2 is policy of credit contraction. The central bank of the country may adopt a policy of credit contraction. Point number 3, cut in government expenditure. The government may cut down its own expenditure or may resort to disinvestment. Point number 4, rise in taxes. Aggregate demand may also fall due to imposition of higher taxes. It leads to decrease in disposable income and as a result the economy suffers from deficient demand. Point number 5, fall in export demand. Exports may fall due to comparatively higher prices of domestic goods or due to increase in the exchange rate of domestic currency. This will lead to deficient demand. Next, consequence of deficient demand. Effect on general price level. Deficient demand may cause the general price level to fall because it arises when aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply at full employment level. There is deflation in an economy showing deflationary gap. Effect on employment. Due to deficient demand, investment level is reduced, which causes involuntary unemployment in the economy due to fall in the unplanned output. Effect on output. Low level of investment and employment implies low level of output. Next, problem of excess demand. Meaning of excess demand. The situation of an economy when aggregate demand is more than aggregate supply corresponding to full employment, it is termed as excess demand. Next, graphical representation of excess demand. So you see here in this figure, AD1 represents the current aggregate demand, whereas full employment aggregate demand is represented by ADO. And here, the inflationary gap is the gap showing excess of current aggregate demand over aggregate supply at the level of full employment. It is called inflationary because it leads to inflation. For example, let us suppose that an imaginary economy, by employing all its available resources, can produce 10,000 quintals of rice. If aggregate demand of rice is say 12,000 quintals, this demand will be called an excess demand. Because aggregate supply at level of full employment of resources is only 10,000 quintals and the result of the gap of 2,000 quintals will be called as inflationary gap. Next, reasons behind excess demand. Excess demand may be caused by several factors, and they are increase in household consumption demand due to rise in propensity to consume, increase in private investment demand because of rise in credit facilities, increase in public expenditure, increase in export demand, increase in money supply or increase in disposable income. Next, consequence of excess demand. Excess demand creates inflationary pressure in the economy. Inflationary pressure is built up in the economy because beyond full employment, level of resources, flow of goods and service cannot increase to meet this excess demand. Therefore, excess demand does not lead to increase the level of real income or output, and price tends to rise still higher. So, in case of excess demand, economy stays at full employment equilibrium level but at higher price level. So students, the remaining topics we will continue in the next video. Thank you.